Number 10, D-Day, laying lots of pipe. D-Day was a day that the Allies had been preparing for so many years. June 6, 1944 was the beginning of the end for fascist tyranny in Europe. Composed of landing spots in Normandy, France, were Utah, Omaha, Juneau, that's ours, Gold, and Sword. The idea was to finally punch through the Mustache Man's Atlantic Wall and get a foothold in occupied Europe. Thousands of lives were lost in a matter of hours. Crazy battle. However, something I think is very interesting and a battle that no one really talks about is the logistics battle of D-Day. Seriously, the amount of stuff that had to happen or to be put in place in order for the invasion to commence was insane. One example of this is the pipeline that would fuel Allied vehicles once the invasion had been successful. Starting in 1942, the pipe was being laid. Eventually, it would extend over 100 miles into France and Europe to supply the war effort. Crazy what we'll do for a little gas.
Number 9. Battle of Zappolino. Turning the calendars back to 1325, the Battle of Zappolino was a large-scale event over a bucket. Like a pail, like a literal wooden, I'm not even joking here. The War of the Oaken Bucket, that's what it's also referred to as. This war consisted of two Italian towns, Bologna and Modena. They all went head to head, and it kicked off when soldiers from Modena snuck into Bologna with intentions to steal the town's wooden bucket from the city's well. How horrible is that? I mean, resources were pretty sparse back then, so this was actually like a really big deal to do that. The Bolognese declared war immediately and sent in an invading force of 30,000 foot soldiers and 2,000 cavaliers. The city of Medina had a smaller army. They had only 500 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalry forces. Thing is, these guys still won. They chased the larger army back to Bologna while destroying towns in the process. Some recall them bringing the bucket back just to taunt the city. They came back like, oh, you want this bucket, eh? And they started smacking it with spoons and they just left again. The bucket is currently and still on display in Medina. If you want to go see it, go take a look. That took so many lives. That many people kicked the bucket over this bucket. History is strange.
Number 8, Operation Cottage. If you heard the title Operation Cottage and thought that maybe Canadians were involved in the process, then you would be correct. Unfortunately, this was a battle between Canadians and Americans during WW2. Back in 1942, Imperial Japanese Marines had landed a force in Alaska at Kisika Island. That alone was terrifying. You know, they were so close. America and Canada, finding out about this, were naturally alarmed. So in 1943, they sent some men to take care of the issue. When the Allies landed, a firefight ensued. Naturally, it's WW2, it happens. And both Canadians and Americans had casualties. The trouble is, it wasn't the Japanese. They had abandoned their post a few weeks earlier, as they deemed it was too difficult to defend, and it's Alaska. It's too cold. Anyone from that area could tell you the same. As it turns out, it was Americans and Canadians firing upon each other in a case of mistaken identity, or not so friendly fire.
Number 7. Combat of the 30. Also known as Combat des 30, you can say that if you're feeling fancy, of course, but the Combat of the 30, easier for me to say, took place during the Breton War of Succession. This was back in 1351. This battle was arranged beforehand, you know, bring your shiniest armor and your most golden gal and meet me at the battlefield at Brittany. Throw a little note in. And then both sides had 30 champions. They had their best knights come forth in all the land, and they just fought it out. One side represents the King of England, the other the King of France. This whole thing was arranged by one guy, a captain in the French banner named Jean de Bonmanior. This event pulled in a crowd. Drinks were literally served throughout the audience. This fight lasted a very long time. Hours went by, and 4 French knights had fallen, as well as 2 Englishmen. So they started taking breaks. Yeah, like a common sporting event now. By the end of the whole thing, the English surrendered after losing 9 knights, and the French in total lost 6. And nobody tipped the servers. All bad.
Number 6, the battle for Castle Itter. Wehrmacht versus SS. May 5th, 1945 was the final act of WW2, or really the last few days in Europe. So when American soldiers came across a Wehrmacht detachment defending an Austrian castle full of high-value targets from some other Germans who hadn't seen the big picture yet, yeah, it was going to be crazy. So the Americans joined forces with these renegade Germans to help defend the castle. I'm gonna call on Hollywood again here. Come on guys, this one just writes itself. The ensuing battle was very hectic as ammo was running dry and becoming something of a nail-biter, when finally reinforcements showed up to rescue the motley crew. What made Germans turn against Germans? Was it 5 years of WW2? Maybe it was hunger, grief, or maybe they were just fed up with Mustache Man. Either way, it makes for a great story and shows that not everyone is terrible. The enemy of mine enemy is mine friend.
Number 5, the Battle of Los Angeles. Of course, we have to mention one of the most unspeakable battles of all time, the Battle of LA, otherwise known as the Great LA Air Raid. It happened during World War II at the end of February 1942. This event, first of all, took place only a few months after the Pearl Harbor attack, so everybody was obviously immensely stressed out. Something like 25 enemy aircraft was spotted flying over LA in the late hours of February 24th, so air raids went off. Blackouts were now in effect. This was not a drill, right? Or was it? Artillery fire, machine guns, anti-aircraft shells, in total around 1,400 shells were blasted off. 2 people had heart attacks. 5 people in total died from this retaliation, and it was indeed a false alarm. A press conference was held by Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and he called the incident war nerves. Yeah, just nerves. Ha, whoopsies, thought I heard a noise. Oops, sorry about your heart attacks.
Number 4, the Emu War. Australia, a land of beautiful landscapes, sunshine, and an accent that I'm trying to master. It's not that easy. All crocodile hunters aside, they are infamous for a battle of biblical proportions, something that was so huge and magnificent it for sure had to be talked about. It's the Emu War. Yes, that's right, the Aussies went to war with emus, and they lost. Okay, hold on. Before I get blooming onions thrown at me, let me explain. Basically, the Great Depression was hard for Australia. It was hard for everybody, but especially them. It was rough. Even rougher was emus destroying their crops. Really bad. So bad, the farmers called upon the government, who then called upon the army, who then called upon a couple of dudes with a truck and a machine gun to deal with it. Trouble is, they were just too darn good at dodging gunfire. The emus, that is. One politician jokingly said, the emus should be given medals for their bravery. I don't even know about that one. I don't even know. That's just, okay, they missed. I guess they missed.
Number 3, the War of Jenkins' Ear. Not to be confused with the War of Holyfield's Ear, that was a bit more recent. The Jenkins' Ear War took place in 1731, when a British trader, Robert Jenkins, was accused by Spanish authorities of being a smuggler. Reminder, this is 1731, so everybody was like, okay, you said it, therefore must be the truth. And so they seized all his belongings, and to make matters somehow worse, they cut off his ear. Now cut to 8 years later, the British are now brainstorming, just looking for a reason to attack Spain and then, force them out of the Caribbean. So they launched this big attack and over 25,000 lost their lives. Disease was to blame for most of that body count, so if you're gonna avenge your ear, wash your hands in the meantime. I don't know, just an idea.
Number 2, Navy cheese. I can't lie to you guys, there's a part of me that would love to get into a time machine and join the Royal Navy in its prime, sailing the sea for Her Royal Majesty and getting into naval battles, just like you see in the movies. Or me, Pirate Captain Chetty, imagine that. Would also be pretty sick, and Captain Chetty and maybe Helmsman McWaters. It's all fun and games until wheels of cheese start causing mortal wounds. Wait, what did I just say? Yeah, during a naval skirmish between Brazil and Uruguay, things were getting a little out of hand. Brazil, having the superior navy, wasn't worried. Who cares? And besides, the enemy had just run out of cannonballs. What could they do to us? Before they could bust out the champagne and celebrate, however, the Uruguay ship fired back with wheels of cheese. And it worked very well. It destroyed a lot more than the Brazilian ship would like to admit, and was forced to retreat. Getting destroyed by cheese is not going to look good on the report.
And finally, number 1, the Battle of the Stray Dog. I grew up with dogs my entire life. I love dogs, but it's stressful at times. You open the door to look at a mailman for a split second, and all of a sudden your furry friend is running down the street after a blue jay. It's not easy. Now I'm running in my socks at 9 a.m. It's no good for anyone. Since the Second Balkan War in the early 1900s, Greece and Bulgaria were going head to head. A lot of conflict, a lot of emotions, tensions are high. Come October 1925, things escalated and exploded. A Greek soldier was chasing after his dog, who just decided to bolt randomly, as dogs do, but in doing so, he accidentally crossed the border into Bulgaria, so he was shot at. The Greeks at that point were beyond upset, so they marched into Bulgaria, and so began a full-on war. By the time the International Committee negotiated a ceasefire to, clear up the obvious misunderstanding that happened here, 50 people had already lost their lives. So, keep those leashes on, folks. That's all I'm saying.
Number 10, the Siege of Orleans. Or Orleans. As history would have it, the French and English were at each other's arms again. Oh, who would have thought? It's a very common trend in history, except this time, France was losing really badly, like super badly. So one day when a young peasant girl walked into the king's throne room and said, "Bro, I got this. A godly angel vision sent me here to fight back and rid France of the English." Running low on everything, including men, the king agreed. The siege of Orleans was to be the final nail in the coffin for France until Joan of Arc showed up. She led the army to victory against the English. They were stunned and she became a hero overnight. It's a good thing not too long after that they burned her at the stake for being a witch. Very nice. No, it's not nice, it's horrible. God, can't have anything nice. Number 9, the Battle of Waterloo. The Corsican ogre, Napoleon Bonaparte. His military career is most impressive, maybe the most impressive out of any military leader to have ever lived. You gotta watch a more detailed video of his battle plan, seriously, the guy's crazy. But in a nutshell, his tactics saw him win the day, time and time again, even though he was severely outnumbered by multiple European nations trying to take him down. Well, it seems his luck had finally run out because at Waterloo, he received his first major defeat, and ever since that, well, he was kind of on the run. He was forced to retreat. They had him on the run. Eventually, he would surrender and was banished. He came back to be a tyrant and then was banished a second time, even harder. And France kind of went back to being France and not dictator France. Number 8, the Battle of Gettysburg. The North versus South. A house divided amongst itself cannot stand. One fighting for a noble cause, the other fighting for a, well, not so noble cause. Up until the Battle of Gettysburg, the South had been winning tactful battle after tactful battle. They were kind of good. General Lee of the Confederacy was making his invasion of the North very notable. However, on July 1st, 1863, that's a couple years before Canada was born, the Battle of Gettysburg commenced, the largest and most costly battle of the war. The thing is, this time it was a Union victory, and the Union used this momentum to carry themselves all the way back down south and eventually to victory. Number 7, D-Day. June 6, 1944, Western Allies embarked on the journey that they have been striving for those many months. This plan amassed the largest amphibious attack in history, supported by a logistics operation large enough to supply a small country. Germany had constructed lines of defenses all along the coast of France. The Atlantic Wall, as it was called. It was going to be hard, and it was. American, British, and Canadian forces suffered many casualties, but after hours of fighting on the beach, they punched through and even further into German lines. Canadians making it the furthest on the first day. Why does this change everything? Well, because it gave Western Allies a massive forward operating base and a foothold in occupied Europe, effectively beginning to trap Germans between two large armies, the Western armies and the Soviet Union. Take that, Germany! Number 6, Stalingrad. All the way in the Eastern Front. None of this is pretty, but it's what happened. And no one paid the toll quite like the Soviet Union did. Germany marched into the Soviet Union by surprise, sending Stalin into a fit of rage. Germany got real close to Moscow, and in the process captured a stupid amount of POWs in the hundreds of thousands. It's crazy. However, when it came to Stalingrad, it wouldn't be so easy. A battle that lasted months. Civilians froze in the Russian cold and starved simply because the city was leveled, there was nothing left. After brutal urban combat, the Soviet Union began to push the Germans out, winning the Battle of Stalingrad, which honestly is more of a Pyrrhic victory, but this is when the Soviets began to reassemble their numbers, rebuild factories and buildings that had no walls or ceilings, and began the fight of pushing the Germans back to Berlin. It was the beginning of the end. Number 5, the Battle of Midway. Out in the Pacific Ocean, midway to Japan, one of the largest naval battles ever commenced. The Empire of Japan sent her best, as well as America sending hers. Aircraft carriers were sunk, planes at the bottom of the ocean, and when it was done, America was victorious. God bless America. More important than that, Japan had lost some of its key ships from its fleet and could no longer engage the US at sea in fear of losing what remained of their fleet. They just wouldn't match up. So Japan stopped in her tracks, dug in her heels in the middle of the jungles of the Pacific Islands, and dared anyone to come and find them. And that's just what the Marines were going to do, effectively beginning the island hopping campaign that the Pacific War became defined for. Number 4, Battle of the Marne. It's quite possible that World War I is the cause and effect for every major conflict since, and a lot of stuff on this list too. Some historians think that the Great War is responsible, so if that's the case, then look no further than the Marne. In a nutshell, European empires thought this war would just be a little titter-tatter, be home by Christmas sort of deal. They always say that. Well, after a bunch of maneuvering and meeting at the sea, the race to the sea as they called, it was time to ditch the blam blams and reach for shovels and picks, as this is where everyone dug in and built trench systems that stretched miles, thousands of them. It would also be the start of the horrible trench warfare, all thanks to the Battle of the Marne. Number 3, the Battle of Quebec. The 7 Years' War was interesting to say the least, and some consider it to be the first global conflict. Kinda is. While not talked about a lot, there actually was a lot of conflict in Europe at the time, especially between Austria and the other European powers. However, for history class, what's most studied is the conflict in North America. Basically, it was a fight over who got North America and or the territories that were owned by each other. That's pretty much what it was a fight over. And for French Acadians, the Battle of Quebec would decide it all. Unfortunately, it ended in English victory, a large portion of Acadians moving south to what is now Louisiana, and lines on the maps changing drastically. The early borders of both what would become America and Canada. It also helped set the stage for the American Revolutionary War. Also cool, because now we have America. And they're cool, I like America. I love you, America. Oh, say can you see? Number 2, the Battle of Okinawa. Years of island hopping and trying to dig out Japanese forces from the Pacific Islands had left its mark on everyone. By 1945, Japan was getting desperate. Very desperate. Supply lines were running thin. Men were also thin because of supply shortages, and well, there just wasn't enough manpower to fight the oncoming Americans. Seemingly at every tropical step America took, Japan met them with full force. Okinawa was no different and was the last island worth defending before mainland Japan. So they fought fiercely, no mercy, and when the Marines came out of the jungle they knew what was next. Or at least so they thought. And number 1, Pearl Harbor. This is the battle that changed it all, folks. Japan suddenly attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Before this, America wasn't exactly neutral, as history tells it, as they had been supplying allies in Europe for cold hard cash, and they had embargoed Japan on their oil supply. So no, not exactly neutral. However, they were fully convinced that they were not going to get involved. They learned their lesson from the Great War and had no interest in sending young men to fight in what was going to be the worst conflict in human history. So yeah, it kind of brought America into the whole thing.
Kicking off the list at number 10, Goose Green Battle. Although the British were taking on large numbers of Argentinian soldiers, their unit, outnumbered, still came out on top. The Battle of Goose Green took place on May 28th and May 29th, 1982. It ended with over 900 Argentine soldiers surrendering. It was a rocky start to the operation, to say the least. Argentinian forces were ready when the British arrived. The main assault force was the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones, but BBC Radio straight up spoiled the surprise initially. At the time, they were broadcasting news, as was happening, of the Goose Green attack. The Argentinian forces were tipped off, and then when the attack was finally underway come the morning of May 28th, Jones sadly lost his life heroically charging at the enemy post. The Argentinian garrison formally surrendered the following morning, and the late Herbert Jones received, as well as his successor of the battalion, Major Chris Keeble, they were both awarded medals. Jones received the Victoria Cross, while Keeble received the Distinguished Service Order. Two para were outnumbered and should have lost when comparing support, but they ended up taking down the entire Argentine garrison, more than twice their own size. Number 9, Bluff Cove. On June 8, 1982, British troop transport ships were attacked from the skies. Argentine air forces took the lives of 56 soldiers and wounding 150. British troops were in the middle of unloading when 2 waves of A-4 Skyhawks from Argentina's 5th Air Brigade attacked. The Skyhawks departed from Rio Gallegos Air Base, and originally 8 of them were on the way, but 3 had to turn back due to refueling issues. With warning signals not reaching Bluff Cove, around 2 p.m. local time, the first strike hit 2 ships, the RFA Tristram and the RFA Sir Galahad. At 4:50 p.m. local time, the second strike hit. This one sank an LSU from HMS Fearless. Number 8, the HMS Plymouth. Just because an explosive is a dud does not mean that it's not going to set everything ablaze. The HMS Plymouth is a Rothesay class frigate named of course after the English city, and it served the United Kingdom's Royal Navy from 1959 to 1988. This warship has since been decommissioned and opened to the public, but finally scrapped in 2014. The HMS Plymouth was one of the first Royal Navy ships to arrive in the South Atlantic once Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. Plymouth, the Antrim, Brilliant, and Endurance all combined forces to recapture South Georgia on April 28th. This was Operation Parakeet. On June 8th, during the Bluff Cove air attack, Plymouth was hit from the skies, but the 4 explosions did not go off. They were all duds. One of them ended up hitting the flight deck, detonating a depth charge, and a fire broke out, but none of them really went off, you know what I'm saying? 5 men were injured on the Plymouth, but later on, in the wardroom of the ship, was where the surrender of the Argentine forces was signed by Lieutenant Commander Alfredo Astiz. So there's a lot of history in that one ship. Number 7, Battle of Mount Harriet. Taking place in the late hours of June 11th, 1982, the Battle of Mount Harriet is one of the 3 main battles that took place during the Falklands War. And they happened all on the same night. I keep saying the dates also just to really drive that information into your head, but these operations went down roughly at the same exact time. The British had 42 Commando, Royal Marines, artillery support from a battery of 29 Commando Regiment, and Royal Artillery. British war correspondent John Witherow recalls the naval support at the Battle of Mount Harriet as blistering. Here's a quote from Witherow on the evening of June 11th, 1982. "We were involved with one night attack on Mount Harriet when the Welsh's guards were coming up as backup. This involved marching for several hours on a very dark night through a minefield. Sporadic shell fire slowed our progress tremendously, and eventually we made a base out of Mount Harriet, which was coming under incredible fire from a frigate offshore. The whole mountain seemed to erupt in flame. It seemed impossible that anybody could survive an attack like that. And this went on for well over an hour, just shell after shell whistling over our heads and hitting the mountain. Eventually this was lifted and Marines went in. And to our amazement, there seemed to be an incredible amount of fighting going on. There was a lot of tracer fire. The whole night was being lit up by flares, which cast a dead, unrealistic pall over the whole scene." End quote. 26 soldiers were wounded, and both Corporal Lawrence G. Watts and Acting Corporal Jeremy Smith lost their lives in the Battle of Mount Harriet. Number 6, Mount Longdon. One of the most violent firefights of the Falklands War was the Battle of Mount Longdon. The night of June 11th, 1982, many recall as one of the most horrifying. 23 members of the Parachute Regiment lost their lives while 47 others were injured. Veteran James O'Connell was 22 years old at the time. He recalls being at death's door. "I had dressings covering my face to stop the blood, and I remember being loaded onto a stretcher. I heard one of the guys carrying me saying, 'This one's alive,' and the others say, 'Is he? Well, let's take him back then.' There was a makeshift mortuary, and I think I was being taken there to be placed with the dead." End quote. He was literally on his way. I can't imagine what that feels like in numerous ways. O'Connell was hit in the head and face. A bullet went through his nose and right eye. It just went through his cheekbone entirely. And on top of that, they couldn't even get helicopters to Mount Longdon for 12 hours. So O'Connell, as well as many others injured, had to just wait it out. The British forces consisted of 3rd Battalion, artillery support from 29 Commando Regiment, Royal Artillery, Parachute Regiment 3 Para under Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike. Number 5. Battle of Two Sisters. The third battle that took place on the night of June 11th was the Battle of Two Sisters. This battle, as well as Mount Harriet and Mount Longdon, were brigade-sized operations that all happened, remind you, on the same night. The British were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Whitehead, and the support consisted of Royal Marines of 45 Commando, the anti-tank troop from 40 Commando, with support from 29 Commando Regiment and naval support from the HMM Glamran. Originally, 45 Commando was to seize Two Sisters Mountain overnight, hiding in the darkness, and if there was enough time, use said darkness to advance onto Tumbledown Mountain. Argentine forces were ready, so the second phase of the attack was unable to happen as they wanted to. In total, 22 British soldiers lost their lives, a destroyer was hit, as well as 3 helicopters, 22 were killed with 47 wounded. Number 4. Friendly fire. On the 6th of June, 1982, an incident occurred which claimed the lives of 4 British soldiers. Navy destroyer HMS Cardiff destroyed the friendly Gazelle helicopter. So what happened? How does something like this happen in the first place? Well, the HMS Cardiff was on lookout for Argentinian forces. Supplies coming into the Falklands Islands, of course, is a no-go. So on the night of June 5th, HMS Cardiff was stationed east of the islands, and at 2 a.m. they detected the British Gazelle helicopter, thinking that it was an attack. The helicopter was actually making a routine delivery with both equipment and soldiers on board. So what went wrong here? Well, first, after the Sea Dart missile was fired, the next morning it was assumed enemy fire was initially responsible. The Ministry of Defense stated they didn't want to cause further anguish to relatives while they were trying to piece together what went wrong, so it was a lot happening in one night. So some articles made it sound like they tried to hide it. It was really just they had their hands full and it was an accident. A lack of communication between the Army and the Navy was to blame, but not one individual per se, confirms the Board of Inquiry. The 5th Infantry Brigade had not notified anybody of the helicopter's flight, so it was a surprise to many, especially coming in at that speed to that location. The radar also doesn't look good at 2 a.m. when you see that blip coming in. And on top of that, the helicopter's identification friend or foe transmitter, the IFF, it was turned off at this point because it had previously interfered with the Army's anti-aircraft system. So it was just an accident. Number 3, HMS Sheffield. The Type 42 guided missile destroyer was the second Royal Navy ship to be named after the city of Sheffield, Yorkshire. In response to the Argentine invasion, Sheffield was sent to retake the islands on April 2nd, 1982. Captain Salt had ordered the ship to change course every 90 seconds to avoid submarine threat. The 2 weeks prior to the attack, Argentine forces were training against their own ships, which happened to include Type 42 destroyers, the same class as the HMS Sheffield. So they knew the radar detection distances and their reaction times like the back of their hand at this point. They used a technique called pecking the lobes, which meant that they would avoid detection by flying on the side of the emitting radar, out of sight. The destroyer was hit on May 4th and foundered while under tow 6 days later on May 10th. Number 2, the Battle of Seal Cove. Just west of Lively Island during the Falklands War, the Battle of Seal Cove was also underway. On May 22, the British frigates HMS Brilliant and HMS Yarmouth were supporting Operation Sutton. This was happening right off of San Carlos Bay when they received orders to stop and take over an Argentinian coastal supply boat, the ARA Monsunan. It was a 326-ton British coaster that had previously been owned by the Falkland Islands Company, but during the invasions, the ship was captured. It was also loaded with 150 drums of fuel and 250 sacks of flour. The HMS Yarmouth opened fire and forced that vessel to beach on Seal Cove. And finally, coming in at number 1, young soldiers. It's important to remember how young these brave soldiers were at the time. I wanted to finish this list off by sharing the words of a Royal Navy veteran who was only a teenager during the Falklands War. Craig McDermott was 17 at the time. Craig was on the HMS Antrim in 1982 when conflict took off. The actual location of the Falkland Islands is different than most expect. Craig explains his initial thoughts at the time. He shared this in the Daily Record last November. When I first heard of the Falkland Islands, like many people, I thought they were just off the north of Scotland. I didn't know where they were, but there's no way I will ever forget them after everything I've witnessed. We were naive and too young to understand the severity of what we were about to encounter. The air attacks were constant and there were several injured during each of the attacks. The suffering was indescribable and something that I'll never be able to forget. Thank you for your service, Craig.
Number 10, Marathon. The Battle of Marathon took place in 490 BC during the first Persian invasion of Greece. It was fought between the citizens of Athens and Plateau together as one force to defend against the Persian army commanded by Datis and Artis Phernes. The battle was the culmination of the first attempt by Persia under King Darius I to subjugate Greece. The Greek army, the underdog in this, inflicted an embarrassing defeat on the many more Persians, marking a turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars. Roughly 25,000 Persians against 10,000 Greeks. I'm on Team Greece, because they're clearly the underdog here, and the victors. Also safe to say Greece's confidence skyrocketed after this victory. King Darius the Great and his army fled with their tails between their legs. This battle was a response to Athens and Greeks being done underneath Persian rule. Yeah, they're like, you know what, we're out, okay dude, we're done. So Darius the Great took great vengeance upon the Athenians, which didn't really work out so well for him. Number 9, Thermopylae. Cut to part 2 of the same series, the Battle of Thermopylae. This was fought 10 years later in 480 BC between the Persian Empire again, this time under Xerxes I, and now Sparta under Leonidas I. Yeah, they were still pissed and wanted some more hands, so they came back. Basically, Greece's Navy SEALs decided to jump in this time. And the Greco-Persian Wars continued. Only lasted about 3 days, actually. Yeah, those Spartans, they're good. We're familiar with this tale as old as time. 300 Spartans held off like 300,000 Persians. Yeah, little more this time, they were definitely not bluffed. But neither was the 900 Spartans and rebels. There was one path in, which was Thermopylae, and the Spartans did not let them by. You shall not pass! And they didn't. If you haven't seen 300, watch it. It's an amazing movie. Number 8. The Third Servile War. No, not the Civil War, the Servile War. Oh. AKA the Gladiator War. I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. Okay, yeah, we get the reference, but who really was this guy? Well, he was a Thracian gladiator who, along with 4 others, was the escaped slave leaders in the Third Servile War, a major slave uprising against the Roman Republic. The third, actually. Yeah, people were pissed at slave labor. They were done. At first there was about 70 men, then that grew to an aggressive 120,000 escaped, trained, pissed off gladiator slaves. Yeah, That's absolutely terrifying. The Roman Senate's growing alarm about the continued military successes of this growing army led to Rome's army of 8 legions under the leadership of Marcus Licinius Crassus. With help of Pompey, of course, the war ended in 71 BC when, after a long and bitter fight, the Roman legions absolutely crushed them. Yeah, sorry Spartacus. He's a hero though. This rebellion is just one example of oppressed people fighting for their freedom against the oppressors. The Third Servile War was the last of the Servile Wars, and Rome would not see another slave uprising of this type again, as the impact had changed Rome forever. Number 7. The Battle of Hydaspes. This battle was fought between Alexander the Great and King Porus in 326 BC. These guys scrapped hard. The fourth and the last battle in the conquest of Asia for Alex. Yeah, this one took a toll on him. It took place on the banks of the Hydaspes River in India, subcontinent modern-day Pakistan. The battle resulted in a Greek victory after the surrender of Porus. Scraping by, it seems. Yeah, after conquering the Persian Empire, Alexander got cocky and thought he could just waltz into northern India without a fight. The forces were pretty even, too. Alexander had more cavalry, but Porus had his secret weapons as well. 200 war elephants. That's the most badass thing I've ever heard. Imagine seeing a giant walking tank with tusks just chucking bodies and horses out into the sky. There's literally nothing more intimidating. No wonder Alexander barely won. When asked by Alexander how he wished to be treated, Porus said, "As a king would treat another king." Impressed, Alex, now king, allowed him to retain some of Porus's land. He renamed 2 cities, however, one called Nicaea, Greek for victory, and one after his horse. Yeah, talk about salt in the wound, dude. Number 6. Cannae. The Battle of Cannae was a key move in the Second Punic War between the Roman Republic and Carthage, fought on August 2nd, 216 BC, near the ancient village of Cannae. The Carthaginians and their allies, led by our hero Hannibal, not Hannibal Lecter, just Hannibal. One name. Well, he surrounded and practically annihilated the superior Roman and Italian army. It's known as one of the greatest tactical feats in military history, equally one of the most embarrassing by the Romans. I mean, the Romans were good. Literally a walking tank with shields and spears. They were practically unbeatable. But they rushed into Cannae, and Hannibal flanked the shit out of them. Yeah, him and a stew of about 50,000 rebel towns and cities, trapping the Roman army inside the city, who were then annihilated. Only about 15,000 Romans. Not a huge loss, but back at home, they were starting to panic, and the Romans started doing anything and everything they could to rebuild an army. It's forever known as a legendary and almost defined feat. Number 5. Hastings. The Battle of Hastings was fought on October 14th, 1066 between the Norman-French army of William, Duke of Normandy, and the English army under the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson. It took place approximately northwest of Hastings, which is present-day Sussex. A decisive yet Norman victory. The English army was almost all infantry and had few archers, whereas the French were an even half and half. The Normans did this really funny tactic where they'd pretend to flee in panic and then turn around and flank their pursuers. It worked every time. Most of the blame for the defeat lies in the structure of the battle. William was a more experienced military leader. He liked structure. Basically, when Harold heard that William had landed in England, he rushed south instead of taking his time to build a strong and large army. The English played offense way too much and got broken to bits. Harold's death led to the retreat and defeat of the English army. William was crowned as king on Christmas Day 1066. Number 4. Bannockburn. King of the Scots Robert the Bruce versus King Edward II of England. June 23rd, 1314. The First War of Scottish Independence. The infamous battle between Scotland and England was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages. The end of a bloody war for independence. Long story short, Scots were like, yeah, we're gonna stay here and just continue to roll our R's. The gruesome wooden wars were caused by the English invading Scotland in 1296. Basically, he was like, bow and say I'm king, or good night. Well, a young warrior, William Wallace, guardian of King of Scotland himself, didn't really like that idea too much, and instead decided to hold off the English forces and was knighted a hero of Scotland. Although the bloody battle wasn't the end, it was definitely the most significant. Unfortunately, like every hero back then, he was also someone's villain. William was captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. The battles between Scotland and England ended in 1328, 14 years later, with Robert the Bruce securing Scotland's independence and adding like 34 more dialects to the UK. Freedom! Number 3. Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt was an English victory in the 100 Years' War. It took place October 25, 1415 in northern France. The unexpected English victory against the numerically superior French army boosted English morale and prestige while simultaneously crippling France. King Henry V of England led his troops into battle against King Charles VI of France, although he wasn't actually there, because he was a little cuckoo at the time. Yeah, couldn't really be trusted on the field. Lots of knights and swords and stuff, you know? That's all I gotta say. This battle is notorious for archers. They won this war, hands down. The Battle of Agincourt is one of England's most celebrated victories to date. It's a history in itself, as it forms the backdrop to William Shakespeare's play, Henry V. Number 2, Orleans. And again, cut to part 2 of the same 100 Years' War thing. The Siege of Orleans, aka Battle of Orleans, was fought October 1428 to May 1429. Again, between France and England. Yeah, they hated each other. From 1428 to 1429, it was the French Royal Army's first major military victory to follow their crushing defeat at Agincourt years earlier. A true grudge match. A young woman mounted on a white horse like a Valkyrie riding into Valhalla. 17-year-old Joan of Arc, the medium knight hybrid, chosen by God to lead the French to victory. Why aren't there like 38 movies about her? Like really? Under the Treaty of Troyes of 1420, England's Henry V became regent of France. By his treaty, Henry married Catherine, the daughter of the current French king Charles VI, and would then succeed to the French throne, cancelling out the Dauphin of France, also Charles. Oh yeah, the old switcheroo, huh? That chessboard of crowns, I tell you, just everywhere. Months of battles under the divine Joan led France to victory. The Dauphin crowned as King Charles VII of France, the hero, here being Joan, of course, who was later tried as a witch and hanged. The whole hearing God in your head thing kind of freaked people out. And coming in the number 1 spot, Gettysburg. A little bit of a time gap, but it's one of the most prolific and bloody battles to ever happen on this planet. The American Civil War, North versus South. The Battle of Gettysburg, 1863, the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Union versus Confederate. Union Army led by General George Meade and Ulysses S. Grant defeated attacks by Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army, halting Lee's invasion to the north and retreat back down south. Yeah, just to throw some numbers at you here, about 650,000 Americans died due to this war. It was pretty disgusting, but necessary, as the North was reprimanding the South, ridding it and standing up against its archaic and dehumanization ideologies. The two armies collided at Gettysburg 1863 as Lee and Meade took turns firing cannon after cannon at each other. Lee led his army on a torturous retreat back to Virginia after the loss, resulting between 45,000 and 60,000 soldiers from both armies perishing in just 3 days. The most costly in US history from battles. Safe to say Grant and Meade were the heroes, and Lee, well, definitely the villain. On November 19th, President Lincoln used the dedication ceremony for the Gettysburg National Cemetery to honor the fallen Union soldiers who gave their life fighting tirelessly for the freedoms of every American.
Number 10, the Pig Wars. If there's one thing Americans love besides Dunkin' Donuts, I'm just assuming because your commercials tell me that America runs on Dunkin's. If it's not that, it's manifest destiny. It seems the second the founding fathers and patriots won their freedom, they wanted just a wee bit more and took over what is now the United States of America from coast to coast. Thing is, Britain was also still there in a land known as Canada, or actually British North America, or Rupert's Land if you went to Canadian history class. The British were doing the same thing and expanding westward. They both got to the Pacific West Coast and everything was cool, kosher, great. Well, except for some islands not too far from the mainland. It was heavily debated on who actually owned these islands. Well, it almost turned into another global war. Both Americans and British were living on the island. When a British-owned pig had gone one step too far and eaten out of an American field, the pig paid the price with his life, causing tensions to escalate to the point where the Navy and high-ranking officers got involved. Ooh, not good. Partially being stoked by an American who to this day, no one knows the method to his madness, but apparently he was looking for a fight regardless. Kind of a weird story. All over a pig. Jeez. Number 9. The Anglo-Zanzibar War. One day a disgruntled nephew got rid of his uncle and took the Zanzibar throne for his own. Classic story when it comes to royals, that's what they do. Naturally, the British who said dibs on Zanzibar were not all too pleased, as they had someone else in mind for the throne. Someone who would let them in and keep empiring as they do. So this angry nephew said, "Nah, I don't think so, fam. Ain't having that." And he started to organize the troops, and in a nutshell said, "You know what, why don't you come on in and try and stop me, you and one army?" Well, it was the British Army. They did, and it's been recorded as the shortest conflict in human history, lasting only 45 minutes. The nephew escaped to the German embassy and the British moved in. The rest is colonial history. What a great story. Number 8. The Football War. It started with the leaders of Honduras and El Salvador. There was some agriculture and land disputes growing, and the leader of Honduras made it worse by using El Salvador migrants as scapegoats for their problems. Classic dictator move, am I right? Come on. Tensions kept getting hotter to the point where people were being treated differently, and that's not good. And because history is a funny thing, the 1970 World Cup at the time was going to be played by the both feuding nations. The passion, the rage, the anger, the music, they got good music down there, was poured into that game. Well, it was enough for El Salvador to cut all diplomatic ties and after the game declare war outside of the soccer stadium. For real. People got hurt. It wasn't good. Man, that's rough. Number 7. The Emu War. Say what you will about country folk, but when small town folks band together as one, anything can be accomplished. Well, let's take a trip down under so I can talk about the Emu War. The Great Depression was tough. That was the case for Australian farmers. It was actually a little extra hard for them too. Unfortunately for the farmers, they also had an emu problem. Large birds eating and destroying their crops. I mean, they're massive. You see an emu? They're like this big. They're huge. The government in all her powerful glory decided to step in and lend a hand. They sent out soldiers with trucks and machine blam blam. So obviously the people got rid of the emus, right? It makes sense. There's armies here, we're gonna get rid of them, no problem. Well, no. What should have been an easy work unfolded into the Emu War. Weeks of trying to hunt down the pesky emus. It was somewhat ineffective. One politician joked that emus should be awarded medals for their bravery in standing up to the soldiers. That's just crazy. That's just, wow. Number 6, World War I. While there are many factors that led to World War I, and some that you might not hear in the classroom, but in a nutshell, new technology, militarism, imperialism, and a general distaste for each other were all thrown into a pot. She was turned on high, and when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, she was turned on high, really hot, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. A lot of people will tell you that's where it started, and they're not wrong. However, there was a lot of miscommunication and correspondence that had to happen between the empires first. In a series of very tragic events, leaders were on vacation, didn't get messages, people sat on war declarations, and before peace could be made, people were pointing fingers and playing the blame game, which is pretty much what got boots on the ground. And or to the grounds. Wasn't good. So in a nutshell, World War I was started by miscommunication. That's kind of awkward. Number 5, World War II. Well, surely after the most destructive conflict in human history, we wouldn't be so keen on another, right? Well, wrong. That could be the point right there, but the unusual event that started World War II was nothing. Just like that episode of Seinfeld. It was a war about nothing, George. I don't know. Well, not true, but let me explain. The factors leading up to World War II were all there. Fascism, communism, imperial expansion, again, revenge, unification. However, honestly, like a bunch of bad parents letting their kids get away with anything, nobody really did anything to stop Mustache Man. They used a policy called appeasement, which basically meant he wants something, he gets it. He wants something, he gets it. Not a great system. Okay, you can have that country, but no more. That's it. We appeased you enough. Oh, okay, you can have that one, but next time no more. That's it, for real. Oh, fine, you can have that one too, but now I'm putting my foot down. And after 4 or 5 countries fell to Mustache Man, that's when they finally did something. So really, it was neglect. Number 4, Jenkins' ear. 1731, Britain. They were looking for an excuse to attack Spain. After all, they've got a lot of loot and gold, and come on, that belongs to Britain. It's gonna go in our museum, come on, that makes sense. They had just about run out of hope until Jenkins walked into the room. Sounds like a joke, but it's true. Jenkins was an English sailor who had gotten into a confrontation with Spanish authorities 8 years prior. Sadly for Jenkins, it cost him his ear. They took off his ear, because that's what you do back then. And as soon as the British caught wind of his ear, Well, it was on. So yes, they did start a war over a man's missing ear because it's a good reason to steal gold. Number 3, the War of the Bucket. Modena and Bologna, 2 warring Italian city-states. One sponsored by the big man in the big hat, which is the Pope as they call him I think, and the other was the Holy Roman Emperor. Big power struggle. Who's in charge? I don't know. This was kind of the way it went in ye olde medieval Europe. However, in 1325 it began to get a little spicy, as both Modena and Bologna would make a day out of raiding each other's cities, because even though we're pretty similar, we'll just attack each other, because yeah, sure. However, it got real serious when Bologna's bucket went missing. Oh! It started a war, and the real ironic thing is it might not have been stolen at all and just blamed in confusion of a missing bucket. Modena steals a bucket, we gotta get him. How dare you take my bucket? It's kind of like when your sibling takes your favorite toy. You did what to my action figure? You know what I mean? Number 2, the console war. My generation probably remembers the PS3 versus Xbox 360 war. I'm pretty sure Chris remembers that. He does. See? But the real one was Sega versus Nintendo in the 90s. Well, how did it start? Okay, well, Nintendo was on a huge roll. Super Mario, Metroid, Zelda, you couldn't stop them. That was until the Sega Genesis released with the edgiest blue hedgehog ever to grace your old TVs. Millions of dollars in smear campaigns, Genesis does what Nintendo doesn't. I'm sure you guys all remember that commercial. It was a really powerful commercial. I learned about it in business class, so there you go, look at that. And number 1, the Russo-Japanese War. This one's crazy. How about a war, cause it'll make us look cool, said the advisors to Tsar Nicholas II, worried the Russian Empire didn't look so cool anymore because it's been failing for a while. And in a classic schoolyard tactic, let's find the weakest link and start there. Well, they thought it was Japan, but as it turns out, Japan wasn't that guy, pal. He's not that guy, pal. And they won, so very surprising literally everyone. So not only did a massive European power start a conflict with a puny island nation for bragging rights, but they also lost that war to a puny island nation for bragging rights. That's just crazy.